Leaving Burma. Chapter 14. While the city of Rangoon was being demolished by heavy aerial bombardment, Kalor had remained peaceful. The morning frost had quickly dissipated as the sun rose over the hills, warming the air and brushing the skirted fountain that now lay quiet after having showered the flower beds around its base. We children were engrossed in a game of kick the can, and there was a hush after the can had been kicked. Arthur ran to pick it up, while the rest of us raced and hid in secret places behind the large flower pots, behind the doors, under the large dining table, and in the backyard, our panting breaths held in suspense. Creeping into the silence came a low hum that rapidly magnified into a loud drone. Startled, we rushed out of our hiding places, and there, low in the sky and coming directly towards us, was the nose of an airplane with wings spread wide. Terrified, we scurried back into the house, but not before we saw the sign of the rising sun painted on its underbelly, and glimpsed the helmeted face of the pilot, apparently staring straight at us. The plane skimmed over the roof of the house, reverberating like a drill into the rafters, and sent the pigeons into a frenzied cooing. The loud roar of the engine echoed throughout the many valleys and hills around Kalor, nerve-shattering to ears unaccustomed to such sounds. "Ab kya hoga?" I can hear my mother saying. Now what will happen? As if there could be an answer. Was there even time to think? The reconnaissance plane that had flown in signaled the frightening proximity of the Japanese. Simple folk who had never seen an aeroplane before, and not knowing what to expect, grabbed their most treasured possessions and, like people in a house fire, ran to hide in the jungle. A long while after the sound subsided, they stealthily crept back into their homes, while others waited with bated breath for instructions from government officials. Shortly after this, news finally came of the bombing of Rangoon, and then of Tazi, only a relatively short distance away. When it was learned that the British government had hurriedly put together an evacuation plan, it spurred those who could to flee. It's not difficult to comprehend the dread with which my parents must have anticipated the war. They had worked hard to build their lives in Kalor, and they also had the responsibility of caring for 8 children, the youngest, Bilkis, just 6 months old, and the eldest, Eunice, only 14. My father had been advised by friends in the government to head for India as soon as possible because the Japanese were moving in very rapidly. In shocked disbelief and with the faint hope that they may not need to depart, they waited to see how things would turn out. But they soon discovered that the Japanese had occupied Mandalay, and reports started coming in of some of the atrocities that were being imposed on the people whom the Japanese felt were favorable to the British. It was then decided that it was too dangerous to stay on in Kalor, and they quickly made preparations to leave on the first plane that would fly them out of Burma. That night, the glow of the lantern fell on the faces of those who stood watching as Umapati, the chauffeur, dug a deep pit inside the floor of the servants' quarters, large enough to hold as many of the family's valuables as possible, particularly those which they couldn't carry with them on the plane. They buried the sewing machine, the richly woven rugs, the expensive dolls, the silk saris embroidered with the gold thread, the huge grandfather clock, and a host of other items. There was no more room or time to add more. Planks were placed along the top, and the area was then cemented over. Apart from Umapati and Jamila the ayah, who also helped with the work, no one else knew of this now hidden treasure, or so they thought. Big Uncle had arrived earlier and paid a paltry sum for our car, after which he drove off with his driver. He was the police commissioner and had now been appointed chief air warden of the entire evacuation plan for the area. A few planes were to fly people out from the air base in Shwebo, a small town northwest of Mandalay, which was a long train ride from Kalor. Chapter 15. As the family woke up and got ready to leave, a rooster crowed away the darkness of night, and the pale light of early morning reflected off the mists that hung low against the dark green hills above the stream. Feeling the chill of the cold morning air, they donned their jackets and, without turning to look at the home they were leaving, joined the other evacuees at the railway station. The train shunted and then whistled as hot steam rose upward in bulging clouds of white. They boarded the train, where people sat with drawn faces and children kept unnaturally quiet, while a chorus of wailing and whimpering babies cried loudly, sensing the anxiety that pulsated in waves from wagon to wagon. An English woman leaned out of the carriage window and told her servant, who stood sadly by, to take good care of her dog, and handed him a biscuit to give her pet. The engine driver blew the whistle again, and the carriages began rolling forward. No one remained at the platform except young Ronnie Sweeney, a close friend of my brother Eunice. He ran alongside the tracks, his blonde curls tousled by the breeze, whipped up by the locomotive. His blue eyes misted with an instinctual precognition as the train picked up speed and slowly disappeared behind the trees behind a curve on the tracks. He was left a lone, forlorn figure, still waving and straining to hold on to the last image of his friend, whom he would not live to ever see again. The train chugged its way through the hills towards Shwebo, where the British were evacuating their own people. In the compartment sat Miss Cooper and Miss Cusack, both nonchalantly reading books. They were teachers from Kingswood School, whom my father had agreed to help escape. Opposite them sat Jamila the ayah, with my 6-month-old baby sister Bilkis on her lap, while the rest of us backed ourselves onto the remaining seats. It was toward the end of February, and the days had become warmer, especially on the central plain. As the train made its way along the tracks, the heat made itself felt, and the baby on Jamila's lap began to cry and squirm until my mother took Bilkis in her arms and made her comfortable by loosening her clothing a little. The passengers attempted to cool themselves with improvised fans of folded paper or anything they could lay their hands on. Shwebo was still several miles away, and no other station was in sight, when the train blew its whistle and began slowing down, and then completely stopped. Panic ensued, as some people imagined an imminent attack from some source, perhaps a bombardment, perhaps the tracks had been blown up. Hopefully it was just some engine trouble that could quickly be fixed. They were not going to be stranded, they hoped. Any delay meant that they would not be in time to board the planes at Shwebo. It was some time before the real cause of the problem was made known to the passengers, and they finally calmed down when they learned that a cow had decided to take up its position on the tracks, and rather than sauntering off upon the approach of the engine and the blowing of the whistle, had decided to move forward heedlessly on the tracks at a slow pace directly in front of the train. The engine driver eventually had to stop the train, descend onto the tracks, and shoo the animal away before resuming the journey forward. As we approached Shwebo, The wind blowing in from the open windows of the compartment felt hot against our faces. We had arrived in the dry zone of Burma, where temperatures had already started to rise in early February. By the time we got to Shwebo, the sun's rays had been beating into the barren earth for several hours, depleting the air of moisture. As the train stopped, a cosmopolitan crowd of passengers disembarked and was struck by a blast of heat. The men and children were dressed in British attire, while the women wore varying modes of dress that defined either their affinity, their ethnicity, or the demand of the patriarch of the family. Some wore dresses designed in the style of the 20s, while others wore either longies or saris. Carrying their belongings and herding their children, they moved forward with anxious expressions and made their way to the small airport. Here they found swarms of refugees who, like themselves, awaited an opportunity to flee the impending war. The majority of people who had arrived were clearly unaware that the British government had compiled a discreet list which eliminated all those evacuees who were not of European descent. Tents had been hurriedly set up for the evacuees, and here they waited to see if they could get on one of the planes. The heat continued unabated, parching the throats of the throngs. Thirsting for water, of which there was no shortage, people rushed to the taps, but the water failed to quench their thirst, for the steady stream that flowed out was hot enough to boil an egg. I am caught in a knot of anxiety when I contemplate that moment in time and feel what my parents and older siblings must have felt then. So I stand with my father, my little hand sweaty against his palm. I look up at his face. It is serene but determined, and I know it will be all right, that no matter what happens, I will be safe with him. As we awaited our turn, Papaji would leave the tent every now and then to see if our names had come up as those who were scheduled to depart. Papaji, my father, held a prestigious position as a member of the town council, apart from being a prosperous merchant, and because of his influence, and no doubt because he also paid huge bribes, we were put on the list of those who might board the planes which had been flown in by Chiang Kai-shek from China. We were finally told that we could board the plane and were the only non-Europeans to be allowed to do so. We quickly took our seats on a Dakota plane, which was the second last flight to leave before the Japanese completed their occupation of Burma. We later learned that the plane that left after us was shot down and all the people on board perished. When the folks in Kalor heard the news, they assumed that we had been on that last plane, and it wasn't long before the secret of our hidden treasure was discovered, quickly looted, distributed, shared, or sold. In India, Chapter 16. The plane we were on landed on the runway of the airport in Chittagong on the Indian side of the border, and we were immediately shuttled to the railway station. Here we learned that we had to take a circuitous route to get to Calcutta, as the Japanese had already bombed Chittagong several times, and strategic British military operations were underway in that location. So instead of a direct train ride to Calcutta, we traveled on to the next town, then were ferried across the Brahmaputra River before finally boarding the train to Calcutta. The compartment that we were in became unbearably stuffy, especially because at each station that we approached along the way, we had to keep the windows and doors shut tight to avoid people from climbing in or pushing their way in. The throngs of people who crowded the platforms at every station had trekked all the way from Burma and were desperately trying to get on the trains. Exhausted old people, men, women, and wailing children lay sprawled on the concrete platforms on either side of the tracks. As the train trundled forward, we passed through an area where the Japanese had bombed a previous train, and the bodies of the hapless victims of that raid still lay beside the tracks in various gruesome stages of decomposition. We finally arrived in Calcutta, where we were baffled by the hordes of people who crowded the streets. We wondered why there were so many of them, and asked whether they had gathered together for a special occasion or event. It was explained to us that this was the way it always was, each and every day in Calcutta. We found not only this rather disconcerting, but also the cacophony of honking motor vehicles, the chorus of human voices, the clinking and clanking of pots and pans, the clip-clopping of horses' hoofs on bare pavement, the tumbling of cartwheels, and all the noises that dinned the air with the vibrations of a city. Added to this was the odor in the humid air of horses and cows and their droppings, mingled with the sweat of humans who had partaken of deep-fried and spicy foods. All of this contrasted strongly with the pure scent of pine and flowers and the quiet tranquility that we had left behind in Kalor. Not surprisingly, I became ill with amoebic dysentery and became so weak that I could barely sit up. I was rapidly becoming dehydrated because I couldn't keep anything down, including water. When the doctors prescribed medicine didn't seem to be helping, my parents, in desperation, sought the help of a renowned Hakim. The day Hakim Muhammad Yar Khan came to see me, I was burning with fever, but my hands and feet were cold and I was shivering. What I saw was an old man dressed in immaculate white clothing with a long white beard to match, but what I remembered most were his soft brown eyes, which seemed to reach beyond my physical being. He took his seat on the chair beside my bed and, taking my small right hand, held it gently in both his large, strong ones. He began by softly reciting ayahs from the Quran. Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum. There is no God but Allah, the alive, the eternal. Neither does sleep nor slumber overtake him. His are all things in the heavens and the earth. None can intercede except with his permission. He knows that which is before us and that which is behind us. None can encompass his knowledge except that which he wills us to know. His throne extends over the heavens and the earth, and he never tires of preserving them, for he is the glorious, the supreme. I realized much later that what he had recited was the Ayatul Kursi. I could feel the warmth from his hand slowly moving through me as he recited a few more verses, and I began to feel quite drowsy. He then rose and, bending over me, blew lightly on my forehead. I fell into a deep sleep, and when I awoke he was gone, but my parents were still by my bed, looking anxiously at me. My clothes, as well as my pillowcase and bed sheets, were completely drenched with perspiration, but my hands and feet were warm, and I was famished. I told them I was hungry, and was immediately given the pomegranate juice that the Hakim had prescribed, and which had already been prepared for me. Within a few days, my strength returned, and I soon joined my brothers and sisters in the games, pranks, and mischief which made up the major part of our daily routine. Chapter 17. We stayed in Calcutta for about a month, and then took a train to Surat, the city located on the river Tapti, which also happened to be my father's birthplace. we stayed for a few months in the Dutch fort, a great towering concrete structure located on the river bank, and even went to a school which stood opposite our grand dwelling. It was here that an effort was made by a teacher at the school to teach us Gujarati, ka, kha, ga, gha. I remember being taught how to thread a needle and how to sew. This I did by holding a small length of white cotton thread in my right hand and moistening one end by putting it in my mouth. I then stiffened the tip between my thumb and forefinger till it pointed at the eye of the needle which I held in my left hand. The thread that finally went through looked grubby, but I was proud of my success. Then, grasping the thread till the two strands were of almost equal length, I wrapped the ends around my finger and formed a tightly looped knot. I soon ventured on to more formidable tasks, like weaving the needle in and out of a small piece of green fabric and creating large stitches in a crooked line. The entranceway on the upper floor of the fort had large beams that stretched across the ceiling, and this drew the attention of my older brothers. Arthur, who was 10 at the time, climbed onto Eunice's shoulders so that he could be elevated high enough to reach the beams. Grasping the beam with both hands, he told Eunice to move away and then, while suspended from the beam, began to swing like an acrobat. The beams were too large for his hands to grasp firmly, so that his fingers slipped, and he crashed to the floor, cutting his lip, which bled profusely. The sight of all that blood caused Eunice to faint, and was the cause of much immediate commotion, and later, when the panic subsided, amusement among us before we entertained ourselves with other diversions. While in Surat, we visited Dumas, a seaside resort a few miles down the river. We stayed there for several days, and I remember the soft, clean, black sand on the beach, which seemed to stretch on endlessly. Remembering it, I can even now smell the scent of the salty air and hear the huge waves as they rose and fell, lifting and dropping my brother Arthur as he swam close to the shore. It was here that he caught a fish as large as himself, and our mother got the cook to turn it into fish biryani. While Yasin the cook prepared the food, he told us that we had taken a huge risk in going out into the water. Didn't we know it was haunted by spirits? Hadn't we heard strange whispers in the wind? Some people, he said, had been possessed by jinns after going out there. After what he said to us, I started to think hard, and yes, I was sure I had heard soft, husky voices calling, and the more I thought about it, I was sure I had also seen strange forms rising up from the sand and whooshing away towards the sea. It was there that I remember experiencing the first rain of the monsoon season. It had been a hot day, and the air itself seemed to weigh down on us. Then the sky darkened as heavy grey upon grey clouds billowed in. That was all the warning we had before giant raindrops started striking the ground and the earth emitted that special essence which only a first rainfall of the season can excite it to exhale, perhaps reminiscent of the very first rain that ever fell. That moment lasted but an instant before water began pouring down on us in sheets, and we gleefully frolicked in it on the veranda of the second floor. This was also where the scent of mangoes, chikus, and the sea was so joyfully instilled in my memory. Our stay in Dumas ended too soon, and we reluctantly returned to Surat, from where, a few days later, we took a train to Bombay, where we spent the rest of the war.